Hey everyone, I'm talking about the British East India Company today and how it came to take over pretty much the whole subcontinent of Asia. Um, so this is a big company, you've likely all heard of it, so let's go straight into it. Who was the British East India Company? They were originally named the Honourable Company of Merchants of London, trading with the East Indies, and the East Indies included the islands of Indonesia and parts of Malaysia as well. So it stretched straight across that entire area of the Indian Ocean. Um, they were originally founded during the Elizabethan era, which is significant because that was the golden age of England and also the height of European exploration um, of the world and finding riches and so forth. So, so we see here, we'll do a basic summary of the history. The silk and the spice trade had been around for centuries prior to the forming of the East India Company. It had provided wealth for many nations, and you see along where the Silk Road used to be, the populations and civilizations had grown and prospered for centuries and centuries. This route from the east to the west was a significant form of income and wealth. You see in the Renaissance period, cities like Venice grow exponentially as the route came in through the Mediterranean into that city and so forth. So the East India Company formed in the 1600s. During that time, Mughal Empire ruled from Afghanistan all throughout India. So they were all in that silk and spice trade region that they had to pass through to get to Europe. They were very wealthy and very, very powerful at that time. So the East India Company came in there, made an alliance with these people, and started setting up ports along the coasts. So this is very significant. You see also, prior to then, the Dutch and the Portuguese were in the area and had a lot of influence and power and say in there. And so having the English come in and take these ports gave them footing so they could move their merchandise back to England and produce wealth for the English Empire. This is very important, this whole Silk Route thing. We also had the discovery of the Americas came about by Christopher Columbus as he tried to find a westward movement into there, as you probably all know, and which is when he found the Caribbean islands and mistook them for the West Indies, or what we know as Indonesia today. So having this route directly connecting England to India was very powerful during this era of the silk and spice trades. So in the 1700s, the East India Company moved from being just someone who was partnered with the empire, the Mughal Empire, to being more and more involved in the politics of the area. They took over more ports. They basically kind of pushed out the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish and took over a lot of the coastline in this area, which is how they became so influential within the Mughal Empire. And also, the Mughal Empire began to decline, and the French tried to push in as well to get some of their money and their wealth as well to grow, like we saw a lot from these European nations at this time. As we moved into the 1800s, the EIC has control over 2/3 of the subcontinent, so they've taken over a significant portion of this region. And even if they don't control the area, they indirectly control it through their control of the trade and movement of the silk and spice. So we also see during the 1800s that unlike Canada and Australia, so forth, India was a colony of exploitation, which is directly due to the fact that they were trying to collect the wealth from this region. So where Canada and Australia, New Zealand, they were all places where they were trying to take the land and make it into a land settlement where people could live and grow. They were just using this area for the resources available. And the EIC justified themselves as saying they were trying to civilize the people and turn them into not being savages anymore. And there was a lot of conflict and fighting during this time. So during the 1800s is when we see this spike in this concern for what is going on in India. So we see after the loss of the American colonies and the anti-slavery movement, which had already taken place and was going on right after the Civil War in England, they began to question the authority and actions of the East India Company. So the East India Company had become pretty much an entity unto itself. And I think before this time, they turned a blind eye to their actions and how brutal the company was because of the money and the trade that they were bringing into England and giving them power over the rest of Europe. But they began to see that they were not treating the locals well at all and were very brutal and unjust toward them. So in the later half of the 18th century, the employers who started to return were faced with a lot of persecution because they were perceived as being these cruel, heartless people who didn't care at all for the people who they had originally been supervising or working over. And then we also saw the former Governor General Warren Hastings was impeached and faced trial for how he mismanaged his jurisdiction in the India area, and he was also for personal corruption. So we have a nice little picture here talking about recruiting men to be the regiments of artillery for the East India Company. So they didn't only just work in trade anymore, they were recruiting their own private armies as well. So they were very wealthy and very, very powerful. So in 1857, an uprising occurred known as the India Mutiny by the British. And in India, it was called the First War of Independence. So it was basically the people uprising against the East India Company and their brutality and how they were being treated. And the East India Company retaliated and was beyond forceful. They were cruel and just killed and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people. The English, people back in England, were very upset by this because it was not what they were moving their civilization toward, which was a more liberal society. And as a result, they came in and basically disbanded the East India Company in the region, and the crown was given the power over India and what was originally part of the East India Company's area of rule. And so a bit more justice started to come into place during that time. So that's how we sort of see the rise and fall. Here's my references. The East India Company was very significantly powerful because of directly the silk and spice trades, and they were allowed to take that place because of the wealth that they provided the English nation. And they just grew and grew and grew from this little tiny group of people, of merchants, binding together to take that influence that they could gain in India and run with it and just expand it into something of its own. It had its own life to it. So anyway, that is my presentation. I hope you learned something. Thanks. Bye.